Tonight we're going to take a little bit of a departure from covering the day-to-day news and step into a subject that I think personally is absolutely fascinating. And that subject is predictive programming. Now, if you're a regular listener to Republic Broadcasting, you probably have already come across this term from Republic Broadcasting's very own Alan Watt of cuttingthroughthematrix.com. And as I understand it, although I'm open to correction on this point, Alan Watt, in fact, coined the term predictive programming to talk about the ways in which fiction, works of fiction, such as movies or television shows or books or any of the other media that we consume that purport to be fictional portrayals of the real world, can in fact be used to embed certain ideas in our consciousness for various reasons. And as Alan Watt has gone through, quite ably in his own broadcasts, he has documented that this is in fact a process that has been known and talked about and philosophized about for thousands of years, with, again, the ancient Greeks knowing full well that their plays, which was a central part of the Greeks' civilization at its height, the plays that they put on were in fact extremely important for the formation of their understanding of the world and for their culture. And this is something that perhaps has been lost in our own day and age, as we tend to think of movies and television shows and books as just mindless entertainment, just diversions from what's happening in the real world. But with the concept of predictive programming, we run right up against the idea that, far from taking us out of the world, what these works really do is start to structure the world around us in a way that makes us start to accept changes that are coming along the line. Now, in order to understand this concept, I think we have to understand the rather incredible historical moment we're living through. And even I, as a relatively young man, have seen just phenomenal changes over the last 30 years in my own lifespan that I would venture to say probably have not really been seen and faced by any other generation in human history. Now, that's not to say there have not been monumental changes taking place throughout human history, but I think the scale and the scope and the pace of technological change these days is truly unparalleled. And even from my own experience growing up as a schoolboy, doing, of course, all of my homework, just writing out my essays by longhand, which would probably, I don't know, but I imagine for most youngsters these days, that's almost unthinkable. They'll be typing their reports, or I suppose these days they might just be swiping and pushing buttons on their iPads and iPhones and their other slave devices. And pretty soon, I'm sure we'll just be talking to our computers. We are going through some incredible changes, and I think there's a way that we are being prepared for these changes. So when we come back, we'll continue talking about the very fascinating subject of predictive programming. Welcome back to Corbett Report Radio, friends. James Corbett here with you tonight, as always. And, of course, you can reach my work at CorbettReport.com. And tonight we're discussing the fascinating subject of predictive programming, which is to say movies and books and other pieces of fiction that we consume on a daily basis that, in fact, might be preparing our minds for a certain future that the people in the positions of power to make it happen want to have happen. So, Where does this idea come from, and what are some specific examples? Well, what really prompted me to start thinking along these lines in the last few days, of course I have touched on this subject before in my work at CorbettReport.com, but recently I was reading the MediaMonarchy.com post from October 30th of 2008, 70th anniversary of War of the Worlds psyop, and it asks the question, sequel soon? And that's a very good question, but I suppose one for perhaps the end of today's broadcast. But at any rate, the 70th anniversary of the War of the Worlds psyop, and perhaps people are at least somewhat familiar with this story back on October 30th of 1938. H.G. Wells' famous novel, The War of the Worlds, was aired as a radio play by CBS Mercury Theater on the Air, and of course another famous Wells, Orson Welles. And that radio play went down in history, I suppose, or maybe not for the right reasons. Of course, it managed to provoke a widespread panic because the radio play took the form of a broadcast of just a regular piece of radio, just a ballroom dance orchestra scene in which the scene kept being interrupted by a news person announcing that this or that was going to happen, or this or that was happening, including the landing of a strange object in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. And as the broadcasts, the interruptions of that broadcast became more and more frequent, it turned out that this thing that had landed was in fact an alien ship that was part of an invasion, and the aliens were starting to take over America. And as the story goes, the show just ignited fear and confusion among listeners all across the country, with people even shooting at their grain silos and other such things, believing them to be Martian ships, and all sorts of insanity. And that was an extremely interesting little piece of history that's usually just looked at as just one of those things. But I think for anyone who's interested in media and the way it affects us, I think we've always known there's something a little bit more to that story. And that little bit more is also posted in that MediaMonarchy.com story. And it comes from Hour of the Time, of course, the legendary Bill Cooper, who writes about that story. So I'll just read a little bit of that. And it says, quote, "The premise was tested for credibility with the CBS presentation of The War of the Worlds by Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on October 30th, 1938. The broadcast was a psychological warfare experiment conducted by the Princeton Radio Project. The Rockefeller Foundation funded the project in the fall of 1937. An Office of Radio Research was set up with Paul F. Lazarsfeld as director and Frank Stanton and Hadley Cantrell as associate directors. Cantrell used a special grant from the General Education Board to study the effects of the broadcast. Cantrell published the study as a book titled The Invasion from Mars, A Study in the Psychology of Panic. It contains a complete script of the broadcast. The book is one of a series of studies sponsored by the Federal Radio Education Committee." And it goes on to say that the public believed the War of the Worlds was real, thus setting the stage for the implementation of an alien threat scenario. And then, because that does sound pretty far-fetched, it goes on to quote President Ronald Reagan, no less, who said on this 21st of September 1987 at a General Assembly meeting of the United Nations, quote, "In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside, universal threat to make us realize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world," end quote. And as I'm sure, again, as many listeners are probably aware, there is a long, rich history of Project Bluebeam, a Rockefeller-funded idea from the 50s that staging an alien invasion would be a great way to take over more and more of the planet, wouldn't it? Because we would all have to come together to meet this common threat. Or even if it wasn't a threat, even if it was just some big theatrical light show that was being played in the heavens by the chemtrailed skies, we would still be more likely to come together as a human species in the face of such an outside presence, wouldn't we? So there's all Project Bluebeam and the history of that, which I'll let you look into for yourselves. But the point is that this seemingly innocuous radio broadcast of War in the Worlds seemed to be very, very much more than that. So I'll let you go to MediaMonarchy.com for more on that specifically. But as I say, that's something that a lot of people have probably heard at some point in the past. So let's switch over to something that not as many people, I think, will be as familiar with, and that is an really extremely fascinating American writer named Thomas Pynchon. And Thomas Pynchon was born in 1937. And as far as I'm aware, he is still alive, but it's difficult to know any of the details about Thomas Pynchon because he is famously, perhaps infamously, camera shy, shall we say. There's very little known about his personal life, although he's written numerous books that have been critically lauded for many decades. And he is really something of a recluse. And famously, I think there were actually no photographs known of Pynchon at all until he appeared supposedly as a background walk-on that doesn't even say anything, an extra on the John Larroquette show from NBC back in the 1990s. Just a bizarre little thing. And then, of course, he's also appeared on The Simpsons. has a character there who wears a bag over his head with a question mark on it, obviously indicating no one really knows very much at all about Thomas Pynchon. So very, very, very interesting person, but perhaps most interesting of all because of his extremely interesting writing. And he has written numerous books, as I say, from V to The Crying of Lot 49 to Gravity's Rainbow to Vineland and Mason and Dixon and others besides. But I think probably his most famous work is Gravity's Rainbow. Perhaps his most accessible work is The Crying of Lot 49. So I will leave to you, the dear listener, to go out and check out The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon if you haven't read anything of his before. As I say, I think it's one of his most accessible works, and you can get into the story, and once you do, I think you will find it's bizarre and quirky and yet strangely haunting, and there is something really interesting about the whole premise of it. Once you go out and read it, maybe you'll start seeing the muted post horn everywhere. And trust me, you'll get the reference once you read the book. But certainly, Thomas Pynchon was a purveyor of, I suppose, conspiracy and even paranoia as a form of fiction. So it was that in 1973 he came to publish Gravity's Rainbow, just a fascinating book that is really beyond description, but I'll read just the short synopsis from Wikipedia. It says the narrative is set primarily in Europe at the end of World War II and centers on the design, production, and dispatch of V-2 rockets by the German military, and in particular, the quest undertaken by several characters to uncover the secret of a mysterious device named the Schwarzgerät, black device, that is to be installed in a rocket with the serial number 00000. And if that synopsis doesn't really tell you very much about the plot, that's because this is one of those, well, I suppose postmodern is a term that's bandied about, but I think it would apply in this case, if in any case, a sort of postmodern novel of, it's an extremely large novel. It's, I don't know how many pages off the top of my head, several hundred pages, and features literally dozens and dozens of characters. So it's really intimidating, and probably it's an experience to read it, but it's very difficult to get yourself immersed in it. But I really would suggest people do try at least to conquer Gravity's Rainbow. Just a fascinating book with lots of fascinating little tidbits and things going on there. But one thing that I always thought was extremely interesting was the story of something called Byron the Bulb. We'll get into that part of Gravity's Rainbow in a little bit, but first I have lined up for you a clip from very recently, and this is not The Onion, this is not a joke, this is not a work of fiction, this is from the news, and it's a clip that actually has to be heard to be believed. So if, Mike, if you can roll clip 1 for us, that would be great.
Your attention, please.
That voice you hear,
Your attention, please.
came from this street light.
Please stand by for a public safety announcement.
In each lighting fixture or in each lighting pole, there's a processor very much like an iPhone. And it takes inputs and outputs, it talks back and forth, and the poles actually talk to each other. The ribbon is cut.
Inventor Ron Harwood unveiled the intelligent light in a ribbon-cutting ceremony. With funding help from the Department of Energy, Harwood's Farmington Hills company, Illuminating Concepts, started designing the wireless communication system after the horrors of September 11th and Hurricane Katrina.
And it became really obvious to myself and my staff that we could do something that would make people more informed, make them safer.
LED video screens and cameras add to the wireless infrastructure that is remotely controlled. It can provide entertainment, save energy, make announcements.
This is a security alert.
And it even counts people for police.
Absolutely amazing, absolutely ridiculous, absolutely outrageous, one might say. And as that report goes on to make clear, it actually buries the most important part of that report at the end of it. But it talks about how it can record conversations so that they can later be used by police in investigations. I mean, just the level of Orwellian tyranny there is almost unthinkable. But amazingly enough, you wouldn't believe it, but this in fact was predicted in a certain way in Gravity's Rainbow almost 4 decades ago. My, how time flies. So we'll come back with a little bit more about the story of Byron the Bulb from Gravity's Rainbow, but I thought I would share that clip with you, and I thought it was interesting how a company called Illuminated Technologies is getting money from the Department of Energy to create street lights that literally spy on you. You can't make this stuff up, folks. So when we come back, we'll come back with more predictive programming and the